For us to spend some time to define the word Islamophobia. The word Islamophobia is not new. It's actually came out first in the French context, using the term Islamophobia around 1910. The French had the colonial presence in the Muslim world, North Africa, Senegal, Mali, as well as were part of the engagement in Lebanon, and as such they were always having a focus on trying to extricate Islam from the Muslims. So in the French context it was having inimical feelings toward Islam and Muslims. This is from 1910. The term gets to be reintroduced again by Edward Said in his writing on Orientalism, and also one of the early works on media coverage of Islam, covering Islam. Edward Said began to look at how the demonization, the Orientalism, the way that the West depicts Islam and Muslims to rationalize its policy. Edward Said did not really provide a term. He compared Islamophobia to anti-Semitism at the time. And we get a number of people that begin to write on this term to try to introduce it to the arena of how to understand Islamophobia. Now it's important, Edward Said wrote around 1979-85 period. This is post the Iranian Revolution. Also during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, where the Russians had an anti-Muslim sentiment relative to their campaign in Russia. It wasn't until the period of 1992 to 1997 that we get the introduction of Islamophobia as a term in public policy. This was in the Rumi Trust report in the UK that began to examine Islamophobia with advocacy for policy changes and examining Islamophobia from the victims of Islamophobia. Now, the Rumi Trust defined Islamophobia at the time as having irrational fear of Islam. And I don't think that term or that definition, while it had some utility in terms of defining it as irrational fear, the more robust definitions emerged thereafter. So today we could say that there's close to 20 plus definitions of Islamophobia, and that's not a problem. That is actually a very positive development. It shows that the field of the study of Islamophobia is developing, that there are more researchers engaged from a variety of different academic fields, and that it begins to shape the different ways that we understand this complex phenomenon. I do tend to utilize a definition in our work at UC Berkeley that is more rooted in decolonial studies, but that's more of the academic aspect. The definition that I would like for us to begin to use is the one that came from our colleague in the All-Parliamentary Group on British Muslims definition that came out in 2018. They defined Islamophobia, said Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. The definition is important. So again, for us to repeat it to ourselves, Islamophobia is a type of racism. Can you just repeat that? Islamophobia is a type of racism. Why is this important? Because within many of the societies that we are part of, whether in the United States, Canada, Europe, there are already an infrastructure to deal with Islamophobia, to deal with racism. And therefore, when we say Islamophobia is a type of racism, then we understand how to actually deal with it. Now, I know some in our opposition, they say Islam is not a race, and that is correct. We'll give you an A+ for basic analysis. But the fact that Islam is not a race does not mean that Muslims who come from a variety of global South communities are not racialized because of their religious identity. Now, this type of logic or illogic that often try to dismiss how to deal with Islamophobia by making this linguistic critique and not actually looking at what Islamophobia points to. No one today will say anti-Semitism is an incorrect term because Semitic is in reference to a group of languages. But we understand anti-Semitism as the practice of having racism, discrimination, and animosity toward the Jewish community relative to their religious identity, religious cultural identity. So Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets expression of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So targeting Muslim women hijab, targeting Muslim men with beard, targeting Muslim religious sites, and so on. Now, entry into public policy area was very important because it gave us a way to understand how the phenomenon manifests itself. So you have on a regular basis what we call everyday type of Islamophobia. Statements that you hear from your colleagues, from your friends. We did a survey where Muslim women that are working in the tech industry are often referred to in relations to sexualized terminology relative to their hijab, especially by white men colleagues who says, "I bet you look good underneath the hijab." And in this way, it is a critique and it's Islamophobia, but it also resonates back to the Orientalist level of discourse that often looks at Muslim women as well as women from the global South as the domain of the intervention of white men in this sense. So we can actually say that there is everyday discourse of Islamophobia that targets individuals, whether it's verbal, whether it's references, and so on, that we see it across the board. The second arena that we need to actually point is the area of discrimination, where Muslims face constant levels of discrimination. Discrimination in job, in employment, discrimination in acquiring services, discrimination at the doctor, where the doctor or the health facilities are not providing the resources and the appropriate type of care just because somebody is happen to be Muslim. We're seeing the rampant discrimination for Muslims who are speaking on Palestine today that are facing discrimination at a high level with languages that we thought it was behind us as a result of outreach and so on, that it came back roaring in our communities. So that's a level of discrimination that we are seeing that sits deep. You scratch the surface and Islamophobia comes out emerging at you. Third, exclusion. And we are facing exclusion from the broader society. Muslims are to live on the margins of the society. We have a period of time where Muslim political engagement was seen with suspicion. Muslim donations to politicians, even today, are being demonized and labeled as being money that is connected to terrorism or sympathetic to terrorism. If you have not watched some of these politicians in Congress on the hearing post October 7th, began to put some of our pictures, Muslim pictures, AMP and others, and try to demonize them in such a way. So that's a level of exclusion, because at the core of it, they're trying to push Muslims out of the mainstream society, so the whole space will be left to the Islamophobes, to the pro-death machine economy, to the pro-militarism, to the pro-Israel forces, because if you're not allowing people with different point of view to be part of the discourse, then you only have one point of view that is allowed to be there. So that is exclusion from civil society, exclusion from public services, exclusion from jobs, exclusion from a variety of different arenas. And increasingly today, Muslims are being excluded from attaining financial services. I speak for myself. My own account just last week from Morgan Stanley was closed for no reason whatsoever other than my support and continued advocacy for Palestine. That is Islamophobia, and we need to tell Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citibank, and every financial institution that is Islamophobic to exclude Muslims because of their stand on Palestine. That should not be allowed to stay. Then you have violence. Violence that is committed, and we know the violence that is committed against Wadi'a in Michigan, the violence that's committed against the 3 Palestinian students, the violence that's committed in Canada, in Ontario, London, Canada, with driving a car on the Muslim family. Violence has been part and parcel of Islamophobic discourses in the United States, across Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Don't let people forget that it was a white supremacist that actually took his guns and walked into 2 mosques in Christchurch and killed Muslim worshippers that were worshiping in these 2 mosques while he was playing a Serbian national song in the background and having Serbian languages on his guns. That is Islamophobia, and those who speak on demonizing Muslims should take account that their voice, their language, their demonization are loading these guns that are ending killing Muslims in the mosque. We need to get them to take account for their language. So violence. Lastly, structural Islamophobia, where the government apparatus, the so-called anti-terrorism legislation, all this countering violent extremism, prevent programs, all these are shaped around the so-called Muslim threat. When they speak about countering violent extremism, they are only saying countering Muslim violent extremism. FBI own study in 2009 said the primary domestic threat in America comes from white nationalists, white supremacists, 2009. But from that point till today, 14,000 FBI agents are sent to monitor Muslims, to spy on Muslims, to put Muslims on no-fly lists, to securitize Muslim spaces, and to deal with Muslims as a walking threat rather than actually going with their own research, their own documented data, their own information that says the white supremacists in this country are the primary violent domestic threat. We need to challenge them on these relative to Islamophobia. I know that my time is coming closer and closer. In thinking of Islamophobia, there are many agencies and organizations that are creating the Islamophobia threat. One is the government institutions that deal with terrorism. The far right that looks and continue to amplify the messages that are coming from whether it's government or other groups. The neoconservative movement that have cut its teeth on promoting the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and using militarism as a way to reinvigorate U.S. strength on the back of Muslim world. Fourth, the pro-Israel forces and the pro-Zionist forces, both from the Zionist Jewish community but the evangelical right that actually demonizes and continue to push demonization of Muslims and Islamophobia as a way to continue support for Israel in the United States. And in this case, we need to name some of these groups. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which I call it the Defamation League of Muslims, have been in the forefront of demonizing Muslims. American Jewish Committee, which wants to partner with Muslims supposedly to counter Islamophobia, has been responsible with the ADL to mainstreaming Islamophobia at the hub of the U.S. society. And we have the data, and we have the information, we have all the data for donations and the various voices they amplify through their network. So we need to understand that. Fifth is some parts of the political left, or what we call the interventionist left, or the atheist movement, that is represented by Bill Maher as one of the figures that never misses an opportunity to be an Islamophobe. And he brings with him often on his HBO show that is beamed to people, he brings Sam Harris. And they think that they're two white men engaging in sophisticated racist talk about Muslims. We need to say that there is no way for you to have a comedy on the back of the dispossessed, on the back of those who are being inflicted with Islamophobia. Now let me be very clear. It is not satire. It's not comedy. It's not funny when you pile on those who are being beaten down. You are not actually funny or satirical if you are actually punching down to those who are being stepped upon and bombed. It is not funny nor satirical to actually go after individuals that are marginalized in the society. Satire and comedy and funny is to punch up to those in power. Bill Maher, you're a coward because you're piling on to those who are being oppressed. There is nothing funny. There is nothing funny of amplifying Islamophobia. There is nothing funny of thinking that you make satire of those who have faced 60,000 tons of bombing in Gaza. You think funny? Look at yourself in the mirror, and I challenge you to punch up and to speak truth to power if you are satirical, rather than punching down to those who are being dispossessed, marginalized. This is what we call Bill Maher, you are an Islamophobic bully. Bill Maher, you are an Islamophobic bully, and we need to understand that. The last group, Muslim majority states. Muslim majority states, especially post-Arab Spring, even you could take it a little bit before, have utilized supporting, funding, and promoting Islamophobia as a way to make them the only choice for leadership in the Muslim world. They think that their seats of power are vested in demonizing every Muslim that does not agree with their politics. They say the only Islam is the Islam that I define for you. And if you disagree, either you have the prison, death, or you leave the country. And increasingly, they're funding some of the most Islamophobic organization groups in the United States and across Europe. We need to understand that there is Islamophobia that is being driven by Muslim majority states in order for them to secure their seats of power and arguing to the West that we will protect your interest. That is Islamophobic. Islam is diverse, Islam is wide, and it does not come through the seat of power defining what Islam is and what it should be. So we need to be very aware of the role that is being played by Muslim majority state. In France, Marine Le Pen, who leads a neo-Nazi group, her party ran out of money. An Arab country supported her party by actually providing resources to her party. Marine Le Pen, who actually championed the banning of the hijab, championed the banning of the burqa, championing the restriction on Muslims in France, yet we find an Arab country providing her support. We find another Arab leader going to France and calling for the French government to monitor the Muslim mosque and to actually engage in repression against Muslims. We need to be very clear. You cannot be a representative of Islam or the Muslim world if you are peddling Islamophobia, no matter what presidency, king, prince, or a state you hold. Those days are over. Islam is rooted in justice. Islam is rooted in justice. One of the 99 names of God is Al-Adl. You could disagree with someone on their version of Islam, but you cannot use that disagreement as a way to exclude them in your country and also chase them across the globe, because that's the only way of a bankrupt politics that sees itself as the only avenue for meaning and survival. That's what we need to challenge relative to Islamophobia. The last thing I want to ask people to do, I want you to be very careful in these days as you use the social media. Continue to amplify Palestine, continue to amplify Muslim voices, but I want you to be very careful, because many of those who are antagonistic to Islam and Muslims are using people's use of social media to try to target you in the form of having material support for terrorism. So I want you to actually only look at legitimate sources of information, amplify legitimate sources of material, and don't become a tool for their strategy to demonize you and push you out of the mainstream and push you out from making impact. Let me say the following: we will defeat Islamophobia and we will see free Palestine no matter what the consequences is. Why? Because you are sitting and you're making the arc of justice, the moral justice, the ethical justice. You are advocating for it, and you don't need to fear that you're alone, because as long as we are with Allah, you represent the majority of justice, truthfulness. The majority of the moral arc of justice in this country and across the globe stands on a firm foundation. So don't be fearful, be proud, be courageous, and go to change the world according to your ethical and moral values. Assalamu alaikum.